So in this video we're going to be dissecting the brain, and we have a sheep brain as our model. Now keep in mind that the sheep brain is going to look a little bit different from the human brain. It's going to be a little bit longer and skinnier versus kind of fat and sitting up and down. So it's going to sit more horizontally in the skull, whereas ours is a little bit fatter. It's a little bit longer from top to bottom, and it's going to sit more vertically within the skull. Okay, so their spinal cord is going to come out of the back half of the brain, and ours actually comes straight out of the bottom because it travels obviously down our back, and the sheep's obviously travels also down their back, which is horizontal to the ground. Ours is going to be vertical to the ground, so the shape is just a little bit different, but the overall structures of the brain are very, very similar between a sheep and a human brain. Okay, so first of all, what I want you guys to notice is there is a very thick covering around the brain, and you can see where it's been peeled off a little bit here, where it's kind of that darker yellow color, so that's nice clean brain tissue. But all of this white material here is a thick connective tissue covering called the dura mater, okay, or dura mater, as some people pronounce it. And that's this, again, this thick connective tissue covering. So that is used for protection of the brain. It wraps around the brain, and it's actually made up of 3 different layers. It's called the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Those are the 3 layers of the meninges. Now the thickest and outermost layer is the dura mater, and so that's what you see laying here. Underneath that you would have the arachnoid mater, and then a very thin layer laying directly against the brain tissue is the pia mater. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to have to do before you start looking at the internal structures of the brain is you will have to peel all of this dura mater off. But I want to point out a couple structures to you before you do that. Okay, so if you flip your brain over and look at the underside of it, as you see here, up at the top, so let's look at the lobes of the brain first and talk about these parts. So the big part of the brain that's all wrinkly looking, that makes up the majority of the brain, that's called the cerebrum. Okay, the cerebrum, or cerebral tissue. So that's all this is, and it's divided into lobes. So up at the front of the brain you have the frontal lobe, you have the temporal lobe near the temporal region, you got the parietal lobe up top here, and then in the back we have the occipital lobe. Okay, now behind the cerebrum there's what looks kind of like a little mini brain structure sitting right here, and when I peel all of this dura mater off you'll be able to see it a little better. But this is the cerebellum, okay, and that's going to be used for balance and coordination predominantly. And then we have our brainstem right here, which is going to be used to connect the brain to the spinal cord, which is coming out of the very bottom part of the brainstem here. Okay, so the brainstem is made up of 3 parts. It's made up of a midbrain, a pons, and a medulla oblongata. Okay, so those are the 3 parts of the brainstem. Now looking up towards the frontal lobe, towards the top up here, we have 2 little bulbs coming out of the front called olfactory bulbs. Okay, so those are for the olfactory nerves, which are the cranial nerve 1, okay, first cranial nerve. Those are going to be used for sense of smell. We have these nerves here, which are the optic nerves. They're going to travel to the eyeballs, which would be sitting right up here. So you have 2 of those, and they meet at a structure called the optic chiasma, okay, or optic chiasm. Now right under that, you see this big bulb here kind of sticking out. Let me get a little bit better light. This is called the pituitary gland, okay? And if you take Principles 2, we'll talk about this gland a whole lot when we get into the endocrine system. This is an endocrine gland. So its purpose is to make hormones for the body. And it's actually one of our most important endocrine glands. It's called the master endocrine gland because it controls so many of our other endocrine glands. And so that's what that is, a big old pituitary gland. Okay. Now, next I'm going to pause the video for a second, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to peel all of this dura mater off. Now, as you do this, you want to be very careful because you might accidentally rip off the cerebellum down here on the bottom and separate that from the brain, and you don't want to do that. So as you're removing the dura mater, just be extremely careful when you remove that. Okay, so let me pause this and then I'll pick back up. Alright, so now I have removed all of my dura mater, And I also went ahead and made my section on the brain. So I sectioned straight down this fissure right here, which is called the longitudinal fissure. So that's the fissure that separates the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. Okay. Now we also have a second fissure back here called the transverse fissure. So that's separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum underneath. Okay. And so that runs right here, that transverse fissure. Again, longitudinal fissure runs lengthwise right down the center of the brain. So basically I took my scalpel and I just sectioned right down the longitudinal fissure, and I have opened up my brain here. Okay. And so now we're going to be able to see some more structures internally within the brain. All right, so let's start with the thalamus. That's this round portion right here. That's the thalamus. And underneath the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. Now, part of my optic chiasm got ripped off on this side as I peeled off that durameter, but if you look at this one, you can see that optic nerve coming off of there. Okay, so the thalamus here, got the hypothalamus under that, and then you have the optic chiasm. Now, behind the thalamus, you see this little gland right here? That is called the pineal gland, and that gland is used to produce melatonin, which is used for sleep-wake cycle. It helps us sleep. Okay. Right underneath that, we have what's called the midbrain. So this is going to be the first part of the brainstem here. Right underneath the midbrain, there's a piece of the brainstem that kind of bulges out, makes this little fat pouch right here. This is called the pons. Okay, the pons. And then under that, we have the medulla oblongata. So coming off of the medulla oblongata, we have part of the spinal cord right here in the back. Okay. Now again, looking at the cerebrum, we have the different lobes of the cerebrum. We have the frontal lobe in front, parietal lobe up here, right? Occipital lobe back here. And when these are put together, you would have the temporal lobe kind of right here on the side. Okay. Now, if you look closely, there is a little section in the center here. So if you kind of open this up, see that little crack there? So that's called a ventricle. Okay, it's a lateral ventricle in the brain. And ventricles are filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which you should have learned about a good deal about in lecture. But cerebrospinal fluid circulates through the brain, it circulates around the brain underneath the subarachnoid space of the arachnoid mater. And there it's used for cushioning, okay, and it also circulates around and through the spinal cord as well. Okay, so fluid would be filling this lateral ventricle in a living organism. And around that, you can see some white matter. See, that's nice and bright and white. Now, that white matter is called the corpus callosum, okay? And its purpose is to connect the right and left hemispheres of the brain to one another. And it contains tons of fiber tracts that are very good at sending signals back and forth between the two different hemispheres of the brain. So it allows for lots of communication between the two halves of the brain. Now, looking at the external surface of the cerebrum, we have these large folds of tissue here, the kind of mounds of tissue. Those are called gyri, or gyrus is the singular form of that. And then we have the wrinkles that dip down into the brain. Those are called sulci, or a sulcus is the singular form of that. Okay, so those sink into the tissue of the brain, is how I remember it. And if you cut into the cerebrum, you'll notice that there are two different colors of tissue that you see. So you have lighter, what is called white matter, and you have dark gray matter. Now, the white matter is made mostly of myelinated axons. So those are going to be very fast at sending signals. And then the gray matter is mostly made of cell bodies of neurons and maybe a few axons as well, but they're not going to contain any myelin sheath. Now, the myelin sheath is what gives the white matter that white color because it's a really bright white color. And the more myelin sheath you have, the brighter that white tissue is going to be. Okay. So one last structure I want to point out on the cerebellum is the arbor vitae, also known as the tree of life. And so you can see it kind of branching out of the cerebellum there. So that's the arbor vitae, or the tree of life, right? So you guys look through these structures on the brain, make sure that you can label all of them. And if you have any issues with it, please let me know.